Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. This is my second video against the Quranists. You can watch my first episode regarding Surah 434 and how you can actually use this particular verse against the Quranist only Muslims. Quranist only Muslims are those who say that only the Quran is enough knowledge to speak on behalf of Islam and to interpret Islam, and that the hadith is not required. I've noticed over the years, you do have certain different types of Quranists as well. There are some Quranists who actually accept some of the hadith as historical documents, historical evidence to show some truth to past history. You get those types of Quranists as well. And then you also have the more fundamental Quranists who completely reject all the hadith altogether. So basically they think that only the Quran applies. And so what we're going to do is, in this second episode, just like we did in the first episode where we showed Surah 434 and how you can strongly use that against the Quranists, in this episode, we're going to use the verses of the Quran in reference to slavery. And we're going to use that particular verse now against the Quranists. And it's going to be an interesting debate. The debate has taken place on Facebook. So what I'll do is, like I do with all my other videos, I'll narrate exactly what they have said, the Quranists. And when I went into the room, their page is called Muslim Modernists United. You would see numerous times, they constantly ganged up to try and overcome me, but by the permission of Allah, we persisted to stay strong. So without any further ado, I'll narrate exactly what they said, and then I'll do the counter response. Interestingly enough, you'll find that the Quranists that claim that they are Quranists and they reject the hadith, I show how they even appeal to historical sources external to the Quran, which is really fascinating, and they always do this. It's quite hypocritical. So they accuse Sunni Muslims for referring to hadith to interpret Islam, which is outside of the Quran, but then they go ahead and use historical statements. They go ahead and even add their own interpretation and even their own words into the Quran where those words aren't even in the Quran. So that's where we're going to begin. I basically baited them. I said to them that show us where slavery is forbidden in the Quran, because of course if you're a modernist, Quranist, you're definitely going to reject that slavery is part of the Quran. And of course, just so we don't put any confusion into the ears of the non-Muslims, I'm going to put a hyperlink below this video and you can see it for yourself, that there's a complete difference, just in case you're saying, oh look, Mr. Mustafa Sahin, he's defending slavery, therefore he's a barbaric Muslim and he's a radical jihadist and blah blah blah. No, there's a complete difference between slavery in the colonial times and slavery in Islam. We're talking about slavery in the context of these people are maids. Some of these people are poor and basically they need a roof over their head, so the Muslims take them under their roof, and because they're going to feed them, because they're going to give them all these justice, clothing and money and wealth, and they're going to basically look after them. Then of course the slave would have to work in that house as a maid. But you see, I'll post the video link below this video and you can see for yourself that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he treated his slaves like his brothers and sisters. There are many hadiths, and I'll put the hyperlink below this video. You can see for yourself how the treatment of maids, which is a term such as slaves in Islam, is completely different to the colonial style slaves that you see in some of those black African, American movies and so forth. Totally different. So here in the screenshot, you will see how the Quran is called Farid Farani. He says here, as you can see in the screen, he says, abolish of slavery fundamental liberal thinking. So basically he's saying that the Quran's teaching is that it abolishes, at his number 3 point, the abolition of slavery, fundamental liberal thinking. This is how the fundamental liberals think, what the Quran says, that apparently the Quran says the abolition of slavery. So slavery is completely abolished. Apparently this is what the Quran says. You see, these Quranists and these modernists, they need to appeal to Western standards, Western values. And this is the Quranists are basically like your secular Christians today. You have your Orthodox Christians, Christians who are more conservative. They try and implement the teachings of the Bible and try and follow the teachings of the Bible. But then you have the secular Christians who appeal more to Western secularism and libertarianism and things like this, democracy, where they leave out the biblical laws and they say the Bible is pretty much outdated, the laws don't apply today, pretty much because they're a little bit embarrassed by it, or they can't answer some questions or whatever. They don't want to live by it. It's pretty much hypocritical, right? So you have the modernists who actually take the same steps, the Quranists. So basically they do the same as what the secular Christians do, only to appeal to the West, to prove to the West that they are with them, that Islam can modernize, that Islam can reform, that Islam can change. Because, apparently when Allah says, today I have perfected your religion 1400 years ago. No, it wasn't perfected. All of these hadiths are wrong. The interpretation of the Quran is wrong according to Tafsir ibn Kathir and all of these, muhaddith and scholars of Islam. Oh, it's Tafsirun. These are all wrong. But in our modern time we have now Quranists, these apparent scholars. And now they're giving us the true interpretation of Islam. And when you have a look at what they teach, it's always in accordance to what Western values. That in itself proves how they are lying according to Islam to make their Western masters happy. So I said to Farid, can you show us a specific word, abolish, for slavery in the Quran? Just show the specific verse if this is what you claim. Now, it's interesting, Farid runs away. He doesn't really want to address that question. But another Quranist, modernist, comes on stage, and their name is Azra Banu. And they quote Surah 2, 177, that apparently in this surah, it actually says that slavery is abolished. And when you look at this verse, all it says is basically it's righteous deeds, it's part of righteousness to actually free slaves. This is what the actual verse says. And so my response to Azra Banu is, I'm sorry, that verse does not specify to abolish slavery. Freeing slavery, i.e. right-hand possessions or bondage slaves, and if you free them, it's just an optional good deed. It's not a requirement or an obligatory deed. The Quran commands to take slaves, captives of war, but it also encourages to free them. In saying this, the Quran neither forbids taking slaves, nor does it say it is haram, nor does it specifically say to abolish its practice. Rather, it encourages to free slaves, i.e. when the battles are over and the captives are released, or bondage slaves who work in labor are freed, as an optional permission. I can even give an example. Think of, polygamy. Polygamy is halal to take 4 wives, but it's more so recommended to take one, since Allah knows how difficult it is as a task to deal justly between all your spouses. So this is why Allah encourages to take one. This doesn't mean that polygamy is abolished. So freeing slaves may be a recommendation to free them, but it's not an obligatory requirement. You just get more rewards in doing so. So Azra now replies back and says, in Surah 2:177, she says, doesn't list optional good deeds. It lists the difference between, and she starts, I don't know if it's a he or a she, but they start swearing, calling me a dumbass, and this is what happens when they lose their cool, right? She says, and those that understand what the message is all about, I'll skip the swear words. She says something about hunting for the Qibla with a compass, those that understand the message, free slaves. She goes, so yes, the Quran is unequivocally against slavery of every kind. Says that it is pathetic excuses. It looks like they're getting emotional. She says, or he says, I don't know what they are. Free slaves leaves no room for taking slaves. As for war captives, 47, for ethic, grace, or ransom until the war lays down at arms. The ransom here would be in exchange of captives of war released with some negotiation. So basically their argument is, it doesn't say the term optional. They said, nowhere it says it's optional. So my simple response is, so where does it say it's obligatory or fard? So it's that simple. So if you want to force down optional, where does it say optional? Well, where does it say obligatory and fard? So that now leaves us in disarray. So that argument doesn't work. So then I continued my response and I said, freeing slaves could mean after you have kept them for some time. Think of it like keeping a bird in a cage as a pet for some years, then freeing it to fly away. Like I said, saying to free something is a clear recommendation. In the same verse, and this is really interesting because in the same verse, Allah tells us to spend wealth on the needy or the traveler. So he's clearly speaking about an optional matter. So it's not obviously fard to spend money on the traveler, right? So in the same context of the verse, Allah speaks about releasing and freeing slaves. So obviously, if it's talking about spending for the traveler, that's obviously a recommendation there. Then obviously it's a recommendation to free slaves. It's not something obligatory. This silly Farid comes back and he says something about, I have said several times that abolishment of slavery was a process ending with associating slavery with riba, but there is no verse in the Quran that says that removing slavery is the same as removing riba. So he's just making things up. And then he goes on about saying things like, nowhere in the Quran does Allah say alcohol is haram, but this silly twat doesn't understand that the same Quran says alcohol is actually the handiwork of Satan. So do you think that the handiwork of Satan needs to be mentioned as haram? I mean, come on, seriously. And these people want to talk about common sense. It's funny because another Quranist came on stage. His name is Zia Muhammad. And he says something, and this was really interesting, right? Because these are Quranists, right? This guy here, especially, Ziyad Muhammad, this guy, Ziyad Muhammad, liberal Muslims, these guys are Quranists. You can even go and ask him. You can see his name on the Facebook account. And he says, look what he says in this comment. He says, just here he says, Allah is wise. Allah does not want you to be on prayer mat 24/7. He gives you an individual accountability and collective responsibility. He says, look at this. Allah does not want the economy to collapse. We can say at times almost the whole Arab economy was based on slavery. So the economy of the Arabs was based apparently, listen to this, on slavery. So where does this Quranist get this information from? Right? Obviously, the economy of the Arabs is mentioned in the hadith, the hadith literature, or other historical accounts. But I thought we're not supposed to use other historical accounts or hadith to interpret Islam. We're supposed to just use the Quran if you're just a Quranist. So the Quran doesn't mention anything about the economic situation of the Arabs, the pagan Arabs. So he's basically trying to say that slavery didn't end straight away, because had Allah revealed the verse ending slavery straight away, then this would have been catastrophic to the economy, and Allah didn't want to hurt the economy. So he brought it gradually. So, that doesn't make sense, because, if we were to accept that, yeah, fine, I understand. Let's say, for example, we accepted that. But you're getting your information from hadith, and you're getting your information from other historical text. But that contradicts you as a Quranist, because the Quran doesn't mention about anything about the economic situation of the Arabs. Okay, so another question was raised here. This is from Azra. Azra now comes back and says, free slaves is referring to those who own slaves prior to accepting Islam. And here is a response. First point, where did you get the knowledge that these were slaves pre-Islam? The Quran doesn't specify that, or perhaps you're appealing to knowledge outside the Quran. I thought Quranists only appeal to the Quran when interpreting the Quran. So where are you getting this knowledge that Arabs had slaves before Islam? And I'm not disputing this, folks. I understand as a Sunni Muslim that Arabs did have slaves. Pagan Arabs did have slaves before Islam. But see, the Quranists can't say that if he wants to interpret the Quran, because they claim that the Quran is the only knowledge, right, to interpret Islam. So I'm showing you in this whole debate and this whole exchange how they constantly, remember what I said at the beginning of this video, how they constantly appeal to historical sources outside of the Quran, but then when we refer to hadith to interpret Islam, then it becomes questionable. Do you see the hypocrisy and double standards? And I also said, as my second point, how do you explain where Allah commands to also take right-hand possessions, slaves? This order is for Muslims after they have become Muslim. So, Banu was trying to say, Azra Banu was trying to say, it was the pagan Arabs who were taking these slaves, and it was the Muslims coming in there to free those slaves, but then, and to buy those slaves off those pagan Arabs and then free them, and so they could free them, right? But that doesn't make sense, because Allah also commands in the Quran that Muslim men have got right-hand possessions. They've got their wives and they have their concubines. So there could be a war, and then women could be taken as captives. And then just like the Bible has concubines, men in the Bible take concubines as well. Even Prophet David, I think he had something like 300 concubines. So basically, the Muslim soldiers, they didn't have, obviously, welfare systems where they could take care of these women and so forth. No, what happened back then was the men would, take care of these women. During war, you can't just set up welfare systems and departments. So the soldiers would take care of the women. Some soldiers would take 3, 4, 5, or whatever. And so they could take care of them, look after them, and, they'll become similar to their wives. And if they actually fell pregnant, they actually become your wife. It becomes legally binding. And I'll put a hyperlink below this video just in case any anti-Islam is listening to this, saying, oh, look, Muslim men are allowed to rape their, female captives. This is also a lie. There's a hyperlink below this video, and you can see for yourself that you cannot rape your female captive. And this is why you have movements such as the liberalists and the modernists and the Quranists, because the anti-Islamists bring up these verses of the Quran to say, oh look, you can take right-hand possessions, you can rape this female slaves, blah blah blah. So the modernist comes in, an extreme version, goes, okay, that verse there is a misinterpretation, or it's just it's a verse that is outdated. It was only for a specific point in time, and that's why they've become modernists and liberalists, Muslims and reformists and Quranists. But we don't take that extreme position. We can explain ourselves because they don't have the answers. They don't know how to respond to the anti-Islamists, and so they want to take the easy way out. But no, we don't do that in Islam. So have a look at the hyperlink below where we respond to the lie of raping female captives. So Azra comes back and says, so there is something called common sense. A message comes to the people. The message says free slaves. They go on to say, to someone who has very basic reasoning, it addresses those who own slaves or even those who don't, to make sure slaves get their freedom. And look what they say. Azra says, so Muhammad adopted Zayd, a slave, as his son. Abu Bakr brought Bilal and gave him his freedom. Muslims in general were clearly instructed to free slaves. Even if you didn't own one, you paid for one and gave him his freedom. Muslims did that. I will take knowledge from anywhere that makes sense to me. I will discard nonsense. It's called having an open mind and using reason, intellect. It is what liberals do. What are you doing here? This is not your group. And they're not your people. So they're getting pretty annoyed that I'm part of the group now and I'm confronting them. Azra then also says, those who are your right possessions are not regarded as your slaves. They're not regarded as your slaves. This is interesting. Azra says, this person seems to be a Quranist liberalist. I said, so you're appealing to hadith in order to interpret slavery in the Quran? But that doesn't make sense, because if I brought many verses from the hadith, you're not going to reject that. You are going to reject that, right? So look, see, in my whole conversation, I didn't even use a single hadith to justify my position, because I'm versing Quranists. I'm versing those who say the hadith is, from a liberalistic perspective, they just reject hadith at will. Notice Azra Bano said that she would accept any historical document if it's common sense and if it makes sense. But again, that's basically cherry picking, right? So Azra says slaves were brought in order to be freed, and I think we've addressed that in the first part of the video. The first part of this comment. We can even go a deep further to this. Quran 24 verses 33. It says, let's see if this claim adds up. Slaves were brought in order to be freed. So they're claiming that slaves were brought in order to be freed. But look what Surah 24:33 says. And let those who cannot find a match keep chase till Allah give him independence by his grace. And such of your slaves as seek a writing, write it for them if you are aware of aught of good in them, and bestow upon them the wealth of Allah which he have bestowed upon you. Force not your slave girls into whoredom, that you may seek enjoyment of the life of the world. If they would preserve their chastity, and if one forces them, then unto them after their compulsion, Allah will be all forgiving, most merciful. So as you can see, the Quran doesn't say you buy to sell. You can buy to keep and spend on them wealth and be just to them. As for Abu Bakr buying a slave in order to free him, notice he brought Bilal because Bilal was being mistreated under the pagan conditions of the treatment of slaves. He was brought from a kafir to be freed, not from a Muslim to be freed. Do go ahead and explain how right-hand possession slave girls that men keep are a different topic. It's not, it's the same as slaves. Doesn't make a difference. So Azra, answer these questions. Yeah, it's funny how they appeal to hadith, such as Bilal being freed, but then they won't accept hadith, which speak more discrete information about Muslims, how they can keep slaves, and how even Prophet Muhammad had a slave, and how different companions had slaves, and they worked for the Prophet and so forth. So, these people, if you bring those up, they'll say, oh no, that part of history is wrong. But then they quote part of history, which they use to support their justification of the abolishment of slavery. It's quite hypocritical. Azra then says, where does it say to buy? This is their number one argument. Where does it apparently say to buy slaves? The Quran only instructs you to free slaves. I do not use incidents that may or may not have occurred during the time of the Prophet to impose rules upon myself, but stay with the discussion. It's funny how Azra was saying, where does the Quran say to buy slaves? But it's funny how earlier she said Abu Bakr brought a slave in order to free a slave. So was Abu Bakr going against the Quran or Islam? This guy's supposed to be the companion of the Prophet, but she uses Abu Bakr to say Abu Bakr brought Bilal to free him, but then earlier she said, where does the Quran instruct to buy slaves? And remember, Azra was saying that the only thing that the Quran says about slaves is to free them. But this person's being an intellectual peasant, because the Quran instructs to free slaves, but does not mandate it. It's so long as you give the slave good treatment and he is happy to stay under your authority. And we've also showed a verse where it says you can spend on them and so forth, and to make them happy and so forth. It's hilarious how earlier you said that the Quran doesn't instruct to buy slaves, yet the person appealed to Abu Bakr buying slaves. Here Zia comes, he's a Quranist, he says, he says that we're misinterpreting what the Quranists believe. The Quranists don't say that the Quran is the only source. They say that Allah gives you two sources: knowledge, law, nature, universe, instinct comes through total human intellect, pure. But all those points are irrelevant, because yes, Allah does give you other sources of knowledge about the universe and nature and science. You can study all of those sorts of things. But we're talking about the interpretation of the Quran. According to the Quranists, that the Quran is self-explanatory and it is fully detailed, and that another external source is used to interpret what the Quran says. So, this guy's just being silly now. So there you have it, folks. In conclusion, what we saw was excuses after excuses, how Quranists and liberalists were referring to hadiths and even historical statements in order to prove their understanding of the Quran is the true one. Yet if we did the same as Sunni Muslims referring to hadith, then all of a sudden all hadith needs to be rejected and we must only accept what the Quran says. So if you press these Quranists, you will see how in defense of the Quran, to show an interpretation of the Quran, they use historical texts, and those historical texts are either hadith, and they don't even want to admit that, but they'll use other historical texts. So this in itself shows, folks, that if you press them hard enough, they will resort to things external, outside the Quran, and this is what we wanted to achieve in this whole discussion, and we did so. They failed miserably to prove the abolishment of slavery in the Quran. There is no such thing, as we have also demonstrated. Best of all, I love how Zia Muhammad was referring to, slavery being slowly diminished in the Quran, and Allah didn't really want to diminish it straight away, didn't want to remove it straight away, because apparently the economic problem, Allah didn't want to give them huge economic problem. But then when you go and ask these Quranists, where do they get the lessons of economic problem? It's obviously not the Quran, it's external sources. Amazing. And really quickly, just giving an update because Farid has come back. And remember his point about how he was trying to compare riba to the abolishment of slavery. He was trying to say how, how Allah didn't say that alcohol is haram. But then we responded, because he was trying to do a correlation to say that, Allah doesn't have to specifically say slavery is, haram. So we're not supposed to obviously drink alcohol as well. So he was trying to make this really silly, strange correlation between the two. And obviously our response to him was, well, Allah says that the handiwork of drinking and intoxicants and alcohol is a handiwork of Satan. So Farid comes back and says, so slavery is the handiwork of Allah because it is not haram. And my response to that is, I don't know of any verse that says Islamic style slavery is the handiwork of Satan. So it's pretty pathetic. I mean, these guys are just going from one end to another, and they don't even know how to debate or make any sense or rationality. And when they are faced with rationality, they just basically collapse. So that's it, folks. That's it. That's the end of the segment. Easily refuted. Just use slavery, use sort of 434, and see how they collapse when it comes to claiming that they are just Quranists, when in fact they refer to external sources. And when they try and misinterpret the Quran, they get refuted on that too. Thank you.